Okay, in this video, I'll be going over how to set up a Git repo for your dot files using the git bear repo method. I'll be using this, well, my understanding of how to do most of this came from this excellent article by Gabrielle Young, but I will be going through my own tutorial on how to set it up, and I'll explain a bit of the background so you can understand how we'll be able to do this. An example of where we'll get to eventually is we will have a Git repo for a machine. In this case, this is a Git repo for a test VM, and I'll have a Git branch for every user on the machine whose dot files we want to track. In this case, there's the sudo user. This is just a test file that I created. And there's the root user, which has in their dot files a test file as well as the SSH daemon config. But I'll be starting from the beginning in terms of setting up the Git repo to track your dot file. When you have this set up, you'll basically be able to make configuration changes to the dot files on the server or your workstation, and you'll be able to commit those changes to a dot files repo for that machine right on that machine. And then you can set up something like an Ansible automation script to restore those dot files whenever you spin up a new machine. In this video, though, I'll just be restoring them manually so you can see how it's done. So first, let's go through what a git bear repo is. Let me go to Git repo I have, which is a set of Ansible playbooks, which is here on my GitHub. And in a Git repo, you have the files that are being tracked, which is these things like the license and the readme. And then you also have this .git folder. And if we look at what's inside the .git folder, that's when we see folders like the branches and the index file. And basically, all of these are different files that Git uses to store version information. A git bear repo has only these files. It doesn't have the actual files in what's called the head, or I guess it's called the working tree. It doesn't have the files in the working tree in the folder of the Git repo. And I'll get back to why that's important in the future. So actually, let's show that right now. Let's make a temporary directory to demonstrate this beforehand. Let's create a temporary directory to show why this is important. So normally, if you clone down, just pretend this is my dot files repo. Actually, well, yeah, pretend this is my dot files repo, and you clone it. You get a directory that has the .git folder with all the version control information and the newest version of the files that you're working on in the Git repo. But if this is a .files directory, and we have, say, our SSHD configuration file or other configuration files, we don't want them stored in the Git repo directory. We want them stored in the real location on the file system. There's a bunch of .files management programs where you symlink from one location to another, but that often has problems. And what the Git repo method allows us to do is it allows us to clone the version control information into one folder and have the configs stored in a different folder. So let me show you how that works. So let me get rid of this, and let's redo that git clone, but issue the bear option. And now you can see that all we have in the folder we just cloned is the version control information. Now let's create a directory which we want the config files to get stored into. So we're going to call this the working tree, because that's what this is called. And then this is where we're going to go over to this article here. This method relies on setting an alias. In this case, the alias is set to config, which just uses the git command with some flags to tell Git that the version control information is in one folder, but the working tree is in another folder. So we can do that manually here. Well, first off, if we were to try a git checkout, which takes the folders, the files in the working tree, the configuration files, the current version that you're working on, and moves them where they need to be, it wouldn't work because there's no work tree. But if we specify the git dir, which you do with the = sign, we specify this as the git dir, and then we specify the, is it work dir? It's work tree equals, and we give it a different folder, which I call work tree, and then I check out, you'll notice that it works. And if I ls the work tree, all I have is the working files, and if I ls the Git repo, all I have is the version control. And we can use this technique to make the working tree, the home directory of the user whose config files we want to back up. So let's go over and, well, first let's make a Git repo and show you how that works. So I have a started test repo. I'll be doing this in the GitHub web interface so you can just see how things work. But we're just going to call this git bear test. You can, of course, do this kind of thing from the command line as well. So the way I prefer to use this method is I prefer to create a different Git branch for every user whose configs we want to back up. So I can have a Git branch as the root user, and then I can have a Git branch as, say, the sudo user, which would be like Connor or whatever your username is. And the reason why you want to do it this way is because if you try and store all your dot files on one single branch and you try and store dot files of the root user, which is very useful if you're configuring if you're changing the config files for any system-wide program or server, such as the SSH configuration file. If you commit any changes as root, root will take ownership of some of the files in this directory, and then you won't be able to commit changes as any other user that isn't root. So one way to get around this is just to keep different Git branches in the same Git repo, one for each new user. So let me remove the readme file, which I stored in the main branch, from the sudo user and the root user. And typically the way that I will do this is I won't use the main branch. I won't ever clone the main branch. So I can just have a readme here, and I can have inside this readme, instructions for myself, team members, how to deploy this. And I'll just store those in the readme on the main branch, and then I'll clone only the root branch or only the sudo user branch. So in this example, we're only going to use the root branch, and we are going to demonstrate in a virtual machine how to add files to this branch on the repo and how to restore all the files in this branch on the repo. But first, so we have a file to work with, let's create a new file, and it's going to be test root file. We're just going to leave it blank. And now we have a file in this branch. Now let's go over to my virtual machine. I have a virtual machine set up in Virt Manager here, and I've already transferred my SSH keys, but I haven't done anything to clone down the Git repo. So let's SSH into that machine. The machine wasn't started. Start the machine and SSH into it. And I will be, let's see, following some personal notes that I have here. Well, I might reference this note here. Excellent. Now we can SSH into the virtual machine. And let's switch to the root user, because that's the user whose dot files we are going to be modifying. So the first step is to create a git ignore file and ignore the configs directory. I'm going to be making a directory to store the git bear repo, just the version files, and that's going to be inside the root, just a folder called configs. Then I want to create a .gitignore file and add the configs folder to the gitignore so that we don't recursively commit files inside the version control directory. So I've made the directory, I've added the .gitignore. Now I'm going to git clone the bear as a bear repo. And for what it's worth, when you clone a repo, that's what makes it a bear repo. And again, a bear repo only has the version control directory. It doesn't have a working tree with the current version of all these files. So I could clone this without bear, and it'd be the same repo. It just would have files in a location that I don't want. So I'm going to issue the bear flag. I already have my SSH keys set up on this VM, so I'm going to clone it over SSH. And I recommend you do that if you're going to store your configs in a Git repo, because it should probably be a private repo. So the port you use for all your services and stuff isn't publicly available on the internet. It can also be on a self-hosted Git server inside your IT environment if you don't want to trust your security with a company like GitHub or GitLab, or the hosted version of GitLab at least, because you can self-host GitLab. Anyway, I've got Git bear repo, I've got the URL. I stopped there to make my notes a little more readable. So you got git bear, git URL, and then after that, you can specify to only clone a particular branch. And in our case, we only care about the root branch. And then you can do, sorry about my typing, I'm on a new keyboard, which is slightly differently spaced than the one I'm used to. Then you do tac single branch option. Then you give it the directory you want to clone to. So again, we're cloning this Git repo as a bare repo. We're only cloning the root branch because we're cloning this into the /configs folder, which is going to be the folder that stores the configs of the root user. If I were going to do this as, say, the Connor user, then what I would do is I would do a whole different version of these commands. I would create a, let's say, .configs folder in the home folder of the Connor user, or maybe even, because there's a .config directory, might be confused with that. Might do a .local configs. And then when I make my git alias, the git dir would be home /.local/configs, and the work tree would be /home/Connor, or whatever the name of the user is, and you can even have it as a variable, as in this case. I'm only going to be demonstrating how to do this on the root user in this video, but you can adapt these instructions to create the right alias for your user and clone the right branch of your Git repo to have the configs of that particular user. So back to the demo as the root user. Selected that I want to clone according to the options I gave. And if we ls the config directory, you can see we have all the information we expect to have. I cd into that and do, well, actually, first off, I have already in roots.bashrc added the alias that I've been demonstrating before. So in this case, config just means git with the git dir of configs and the work tree of, in this case, the root of the file system. It's going to be the home folder of whatever user whose configs you want to back up, or if you want to back up configs for the entire system in your /etc and your /user/lib, whatever the case may be. In that case, you want to give it the root of your file system. And since I already have that alias, I can do a config status in my directory, and I'll explain what's going on here in a bit. But you see how we have all these untracked files? Well, Git will tell you any files in your working directory that haven't been added to Git. But since my working directory is the root of my entire file system, I will literally get a list of everything on my file system that I haven't committed. And I don't want that, because I'm only going to commit to this Git repo the config files that I care about. So to disable this, I can run this command, which I'll run here. And then if I do a config status, which again is a git status with the options to tell it which directories I'm working with, all I see is that I deleted the testroot file. Now, the reason it's saying I deleted the testroot file, because we go up to the root, there's no testroot file. But if I issue a, and then just to verify here, the only branch I have is root, cloned it down as the root branch. And on the root branch, we have testroot file in the root of that branch. So if I do a config checkout, well, testroot file? Yeah, testroot file is right there. Now, there's no content in it, but as you can see, what config checkout did is it took all the files present in this Git repo, and it moved them where they need to be relative to the working directory, which is the root of my file system. So we're going to go through this one more time, and it should hopefully be made more clear. In this case, I can do a config status, and there's no changes. Well, let me add some text. This is text from the tutorial. I just added that text into the test root file. In addition, let me go into etc ssh, and let's say I made some changes to my SSH config. In this case, it's just going to be comments that I make, but you might change the default port, you might disable password logging, whatever you want to do. Now, I just changed a config on this server. I want to add that to be tracked under version control. Config add sshd_config. Now, if I do a config status, I modified this file, added a new file. So if I remember correctly, let's see, it'd be config commit tech a tech m, and this will commit the changes both to the testroot file and also to the sshd commands. And now those are committed. So if I do a config push, you'll have to do this the first time. You need to set the upstream that you're pushing towards to be the root branch on this Git repo. And Git gives you the command to do that. And I believe to run this command, you have to be in the Git repo directory, but you only have to run this command once. So run this command, it will push those changes up. And now, if we refresh here, you'll see we have more files in our Git repo. We have the initial testroot file, except there's the text that I added. And then we have etc ssh sshd underscore config. Now, after I've done that one time, I can go anywhere I want. I can go user, lib, I can touch other test file. I can add that added file. I can add that, add some text, and I can, and you know, what change did I do? Oh, okay, I added another text file. Let's run a git diff to see what I changed. Oh, okay, I changed by I added some text to that file. So then config, commit, then the change. Well, these are changes not staged for commit, so I need to config, commit, add all those changes, and then it's going to be added some text, and config push. And from now on, I just need to do config push because I set the upstream origin URL once. And you'll see that now, if I go back to the .files repo, it's taking me back to the main branch for some reason. There we go. Now I have user lib, another test file. So that's how you incrementally add the configs that you change as you configure your server. But what about if you blow away your server and you want to restore from this Git repo? Let's test that now. So I'm going to power off the server, and now I'm going to restore to this snapshot, which is where I've run the updates and I've added my SSH keys, but I haven't added the repo. So by restoring to this snapshot, I've undone all the changes that we have seen in this video. Let me start up that server again. Let's actually see the progress of it booting. And there we go. It has finished booting, meaning I can now SSH into it. Because again, I restored to a snapshot where I'd already added my SSH keys. You in the real world would have to add your SSH keys, but I'm not going to do that here. And SSH there. But now, I go to the root file, which is called testroot file, isn't there. Can't tab complete. If I go to SSH, and I vi SSHD, I don't see my test comment that I added here. So how do I restore those changes? Well, we already saw some of this before. We make the configs directory. We add a git ignore. We ignore the configs directory. Then we git clone as a bare repo. This repo on the branch root with a single branch option into the configs folder. But we have another problem. Well, and then we issue this command to, when we do a config status, not show us all the files we haven't added. But we have another problem. So these two files were new files. I can just do a git checkout or a config checkout. In fact, let's do this right now. And it will move those files in. But oh, look, it couldn't move sshd underscore config because there's a default version of sshd underscore config. So it did it move in the testroot file? Looks like it didn't move any of the files because there was one error. So how can we delete or back up the default files, the files in place that we want to replace with our custom versions? Well, you can do that with some shell commands. First, I'm going to make a directory in the home folder of the current user, which in this case is root, and I just called it root default configs backup. And then second, I'm going to run this command. Okay, my notes were corrupted and they had the wrong command in them, but I believe I've fixed the command. So I'll copy paste it and then I'll tell you. Okay, yeah, I believe that worked. Let me just test it and I'll explain what happened. Yeah, okay. So what this command does is it issues the git status right here. Then it greps out just the deleted files. It prints the second column, which is just the file name here. And then it moves this file name to the folder that I created. So to review, first, I made a directory to store the original copies of the files we need to get rid of so we can perform a git checkout. Then I run this command to move automatically all of the files that need to be moved in place need to be moved to another place, to this backup folder, and you'll get an error for the files that aren't already there, but that error is harmless. It will still do what you need it to do. And we can tell this, or we can tell that it worked by catting out this SSHD config, which is just the default one. We can tell it's just the default one because there's no comment there. And then if we go into configs and we perform a config checkout, and now we let's see, SSHD, SSH underscore config. There's my test comment. So this is my new version of the SSHD config. And in addition, we'll remember that I had something in user lib and it was another test file. Oh, look, it's there, and there's some text. So to review, what we've done is we've created a Git repo with a separate branch per user. We have cloned just this branch as a bare repo with a working tree as the root of the file system, or if you're using this for a non-root user, it will be the home directory of that user. Then we've added some configuration files, we've committed changes to them, and we have restored the server and redeployed automatically all of the config files in this Git repo. Now you can take the manual steps that I showed and add them to an Ansible playbook or something, and set this up to automatically version control your configs and deploy them when you reload your server using a Git bare repo.